I sure.
I got an interesting story about you.
Oh, you have to tell us.
Well, down in South Georgia, along the courthouse, bring that over to the order. So in the summertime, it was brutal trying to on everybody. And the funeral home got in the habit of bringing everybody fans. And so we didn't think about it, it hadn't done us so much. We got in getting ready to go, and all of a sudden, fence counsel stands up, so I got a motion here on it. He said, "Now approach the fence." So I went up there and he said, "No, that's a hurricane." I said, "Yes, we know that." So the fans, he said, "What about the fans?" You know, went up and had funeral home.
No, she's moved to the other side.
Yeah, take them all downstairs, put that.
Morning, sir.
Paper, glue or something.
That back's feeling better.
Still hurts. A little bit.
Wasn't it a good week? Good job.
Pretty good. Pretty busy. Not like the weekend started yet, so no rest to start it yet.
I worked yesterday.
Yes, sir.
You ever heard of a guy named Chris Murphy or Murphy? I might tell you something today. Usually, everything I've heard of somebody you always know of, but
Some.
it's an achievement if I can,
Is that right?
if I can teach you something.
We've got 3 more minutes before we start.
But I kind of like you with the Monday night thing. With the Lions over. When I walked in and I saw all those people last week,
I was shocked. And then I
Half the church.
I know. All right.
I was the same.
I do better when we have a smaller crowd.
Yeah, it was pretty impressive.
It was impressive. We're talking about last Monday night at Bill Wiggins' house for the men's Bible study. I don't know what the maximum number of people that he can get into his house.
Pretty close.
But we filled his family room, kitchen, and breakfast room up with folks. 24, right? 24 people. I have to make at least 24, 25 copies. I don't know if we get the same number, but we had a good turnout.
Yes.
A very good turnout. Even
Considering no
Freeman,
food
we saw
was served
Freeman
in there.
Huh?
So considering no food was served, that's pretty good,
Oh, goodness. Take this off so I can know we're going to go over our time. Glad to know about the color code. I used to remember it when I was able to get connected to the system. I would bring a laptop in and would print straight from there to the printer. So, and for some reason I lost the ability to do that.
For some reason, if I'm at home and I'm on my laptop, I'll forget to change when I'm in here on Tuesday, I print up here.
And you're sitting at the church.
I'll print it out of there and I come in on Tuesday.
There it
Is
is.
this yours?
That's pretty.
I have no idea. I didn't, as far as I know, I didn't say it.
You print your bills and stuff.
When I was in the IRS, we had that same problem, and I had my own personal printer, but some folks would print some things and go out to the big printer, and it was sensitive stuff.
Yes.
And they dash to it, and lo and behold, it'd always be somebody there picking it up and reading it. I said, "Oh, Lordy."
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We are today going to talk about actually my personal favorite psalm, which is Psalm 139. Last week, the very popular, very well known Psalm 23 helped us focus on that God is. Good morning, that God is our shepherd and our host. Today we're going to get very personal. We're going to talk about how we can go to the Father, and we're going to recognize in these words that are really like a prayer. Book. Oh, yeah. And then, by the way, as we're looking at these books, start to pick up the new book, which will help us beginning on September the 7th. But anyway, back to Psalm 139. It is a prayer, but it's also David intended for it to be sung in worship. And whereas Psalm 23 focused on the shepherd and the host and how God is walking with us, this particular psalm recognizes that God knows everything. Now, that can be a little scary. There's nowhere one can hide from God. Ask Jonah that. Did Jonah try to hide from God? Absolutely. And was he successful? He couldn't hide from God, nor can we. And in these words, it talks about the fact that we cannot hide. Now, the opening question I want to raise here is, why is it important to know your purpose in life? What happens when you don't? Why is it important to know your purpose in life? Boy, everyone's searching for it all the time. Any thoughts? Why is it important? Or is it not important? Does it matter whether you know what your purpose in life is all about?
Yeah, that would help.
It helps a lot. Years ago, when I started traveling with the government, I was out in Los Angeles. This is the late 80s. And they kept talking about having to get out of work early to go see their analysts. And I said, okay. And then someone else would say, well, I got my appointment with my analyst. And it was so common that I was amazed that people in Southern California have analysts. And they really don't have psychological problems. They just want to go talk to somebody who talks to them back. And to know everything about their private thoughts. Their analysts would hear. And it's amazing to me that if we are searching for our purpose in life, who knows us better than anybody else? Not an analyst, but God, right? And in this psalm, God is going to know us from our head to our toes. He even knows what we are thinking, even before we say it, because He is God. When my mother had her heart attack, this is almost 20 years ago, I was in Washington, D.C. We were on Friday night. We were watching a TV show. Remember, it was called Family Affair. Remember Family Affair? It was an old TV show from the 60s. And I looked over at her, and she was in her chair, I was in my chair, and she was laughing and everything. And the next moment I looked over, and there was this, she wasn't there. And it was experiencing a heart attack. And we called the 911. Luckily, the neighbor next door was a heart nurse, so she came over. But got her to the hospital, and she was in a stupor. You know what a stupor is? Kind of like in a coma type way. Everything just kind of shut down. And so overnight, I sat with her by a hospital bed, and I read the Psalm 139 over and over again. And it comforted me that night. I was scared to death. like I said last week, one of my shadows of the valleys of death that I experienced, where I was just not able to think, not even able to consider what was going on properly. I was just shocked. And this psalm helped connect me that night and kept me going through the night. So we are going to be focusing on that. In the psalm, there are actually 4 attributes of God that are noted. The first one is his knowledge of all about us. His presence, always with us. First, last week we talked about he walks with us as our shepherd. He hosts our banquets. He provides for us entirely. His power, he created us. And the last one is his holiness. Now, this particular lesson, for some reason or other, I do not know why, they do not cover his holiness. We are going to talk about his knowledge, his presence, and his power today. And the last part of the psalm is his holiness, which we will not cover, but it is part of the 4 attributes of God. Now, there's a couple of key little words here that you're going to hear from Wayne and from Wes. Omnipresence. What does omnipresence mean? God is that. He's everywhere. Simultaneously. That is a hard thing to get your hands around. Okay, the world has got a lot of people in it, right? And God created all of us. And he has the ability to be everywhere at the same time. Does that not humble you? Think about that. And that he cares about even the hair on our head, even when we have fewer and fewer each year. He cares. And then this omniscience. Omniscience is he knows everything. He's all-knowing. And so today we're going to get into these verses. We're going to begin with Wayne. He's going to go through the first 4 verses, and then Wes is going to cover the last. And then we're going to close with a question about how we can possibly recognize that God's presence is with us always, and maybe recall instances in which we would have wished God was not there with us because we've done something bad, maybe. So we're going to cover that in a time of prayer at the end. So with that in mind, Wayne, I'll turn it over to you.
All righty, thank you, Peter. Is anybody here able to see into the future?
I wish I could, but I can't.
I'm not supposed to talk about that.
Peter was talking about people seeing their analysts. I remember I hadn't seen them lately. I don't know if I'm watching different TV shows or what, but there's been commercials on TV about California psychics. Has anybody ever seen?
Is that when you can call and dial or
You
something?
can dial up and talk to them. Well, back during Jesus' day, there was a lot of trouble with people making idols, or they would build their own gods if they needed. The Romans had their gods, the Greeks had their gods, and I guess it just helped people if they had something in front of them that they could see this God. St. Augustine said that a God is not really much of a God if he can't see into the future, and I like that. While I was studying for the Sunday school lesson, I came across a guy by the name of Chris Morphew. Now, Chris Morphew is from Sydney, Australia, and he's a counselor in a school, and his ministry or his mission is that he kind of talks to youth and middle schoolers, that kind of people who are of an impressionable age. And Wes, I was interested in this because of my grandkids, and this, you might be interested in it too. He had one book that I caught my attention, and the name of the book is "Who Am I and Why Do I Matter?" And I thought about what Peter had written down in here, that having a sense of purpose is fundamental to all human beings. Now and I'll give you this, he's got a complete collection of books that he's written for middle schoolers and youth. And one of them is, why does God let bad things happen? How can I feel closer to God? What happens when we die? How can I be sure of what's right and wrong? And how do we know Christianity is really true? So big questions. And not only for kids, but for us too. I was also thinking that a few years ago when during COVID, I got all the vaccines that I could. I tell people I never met a vaccine I didn't like, so I'll take anything. And I got all my vaccines, and lo and behold, I got COVID anyway. So, and I went to the doctor, and I tested positive for COVID, and I thought, well, they're going to give me this long list of things that you need to do or not do, or medicines you can take. Nothing. There was just none of that. And the doctor didn't say anything really. And I asked her, I said, so what do I do? And she said, well, just go home, and if you start feeling bad, go to the hospital. I thought, what kind of doctorate is that? So I got home, and the next day, lo and behold, Dwayne Collier called me. Now, you guys don't know, Dwayne is, he was a member of this church. He and his wife, Jane Gray, moved up to Blue Ridge now. But Dwayne was a doctor. And he called me up and he said, I heard you got COVID. And he said, I was just thinking about you. And I just wanted to tell you some things that I found out that I know and might could help you, that kind of thing. And he had actually gotten COVID before there was any vaccines or anything, and survived it okay. But it just made me, it was so comforting to think that, okay, here was a doctor telling me that, hey, he was thinking about me and thinking about the situation. And I thought, how wonderful it is to have somebody like that thinking about me. Well, as I started thinking about this lesson, we have the master physician in God who's thinking about us all the time, really. Now, Peter talked about this big theological word, omniscience. And that means that God is all-knowing. Peter talked about how many people are in the world. Peter's stealing a lot of my lesson here, so I'll have to talk to him about that. But, there's about 9 billion people on earth right now. Think about that. And I've heard it said that from the beginning of time up until sometime in the last century, there's been about 9 billion people from beginning of time to the end. So figure that's 18 to 20 billion people that God knows and tries to keep up with. And David thought, well, that's a lot of people. And he says, I'm incapable of trying to even understand something like that. And I think he's right. But David in Psalm 139, 1 through 4, he explains all this, and he says all this, and said David didn't have to use the big words, omniscient. So I'm going to read Psalm 139, 1 through 4. Messing around on my phone, so let me get to it. And I'm going to introduce you to a new version that Wes introduced me to a new.
Oh, your favorite version, huh?
NIRV, which is NIV for kids, I guess.
It's more on my level.
Me too. So that's the reason I like it. Psalm 139, 1 through 4. Lord, you have seen what is in my heart. You know all about me. You know when I sit down and when I get up. You know what I'm thinking even before. You know what I'm thinking even though you are far away. You know when I go out to work and when I come back home. You know exactly how I live. Lord, even before I speak a word, you know all about it. And what David's trying to portray is that even though that this awesome, omniscient God is very personal to us. He gets down when he knows us like this. They emphasize that God knows us completely. Our hearts, our actions, our thoughts, our habits, and even our words. In verse 1, God talks about that he sees what's in our heart and fully understands all of our motives, feelings, and desires. In verse 2, he talks about he knows every movement of our daily lives. When we go out to work, when we come home, and even our thoughts before they're even formed. As Peter said, sometimes it's a little intimidating and scary.
But
Then-
accountable.
Yeah. And then he's aware of both our routines and our habits, big and small things. I thought about, well, what is something that I know that you guys don't know about me? Probably nobody but me and God know it. And I thought about when I was about 15 years old, I broke my ankle in school. And still to this day, if I get tired, if I exercise, if I do anything, I started limping when I was 15 years old, and I still limp around sometimes. I have people look at me and say, "Are you limping for some reason?" I said, "Well, I always limp for something. But anytime if I exercise, if I just get weary and worn down, I'll start limping like that." And I think that God, when God sees me limping, that He recognizes what's going on, and to know that how personal that is. God knows words that we'll say and the intentions behind them even before we speak them. Wes and I have a songwriter, singer that we like, both of us do. You might have heard of him, a guy by the name of Bob Dylan. And he's got a song that we both like. It's called Every Grain of Sand. And I thought about some of the words in there as he's talked about, then onward in my journey, I come to understand that every hair is numbered like every grain of sand. And that's just, focusing on the fact that God knows us intimately and loves us that way. Matter of fact, in the 4 verses, these first 4 verses, if you count the I's and the me's and the my's in there, that 9 times in these first 4 verses, David refers to I or me or my. That is something that's very, very personal. I want to kind of, in summary, close with a kind of a practical takeaway. And then I want to talk about, there's 3 things from the New Testament, kind of 3 examples that talks about this all-knowing God. Because God knows everything about us, we can pray openly. I think it was 2 weeks ago, we did the Psalm on forgiveness. And one of the things that said in there, because God already knows everything that we do, we can come to Him openly and we can pray for forgiveness. And we can rest in His care and be reassured that He hears us. And we talked about being intimidated by having to live everything out in front of God, but we also have an opportunity to choose a life that we can live in a way that honors Him every day. There was an encounter that Jesus had after He was resurrected, and if you remember the story, Peter denied Christ 3 times, and this was right before He was crucified. So He was crucified and He was resurrected, and Peter still hasn't talked to Him. He hadn't seen Him or hasn't talked to Him. And so there's this scene in the Bible that Christ comes up to Peter and he starts to ask him questions. Peter, do you love me? And Peter said, of course, Lord, you know that I love you. And he asks him that again, and he asks him a 3rd time. He says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says something there. He says, Lord, you know all things, and you know that I love you. There again is that intimate, personal relationship. There's also a scene that's recorded in John verse 1, 43 through 50. And this is the story of when Jesus calls Philip to be a disciple. Now, Philip had been a follower of John the Baptist. And I think his brother Nathaniel probably had too. But let me read this to you. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Philip was from the town of Bethsaida. So were Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael, who was his brother, and he told him, "We have found the one whom Moses wrote about in the law. The prophets also wrote about him. He is Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? Nathanael asked, "Come and see." Philip told him. Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, and here's what Jesus said to him. "He is a true Israelite. Nothing about him is false." And Nathanael said, "How do you know me?" And Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree. I saw you there before Philip called to you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You will see greater things than that." Then he said to the disciples, "What I'm about to tell you is true. You will see heaven open. You will see the angels of God going up and coming down on the Son of Man." Another intimate relationship. And then finally, this is my favorite, John 10. And we talked about the 23rd Psalm last week. And Jesus describes himself, when we talked about being a shepherd, Jesus describes himself as the good shepherd. Psalm 10, 11 through 14. "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives life for the sheep, gives his life for the sheep. The hired man is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when the hired man sees the wolf coming, he leaves the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired man. He does not care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me." Let me repeat that. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me.
It's very strong. Now, it is this personal relationship that this next section really goes into. Peter had started there at the beginning when we were talking about our purpose and how important it is to know your own purpose. And I do think that the second question there sometimes, what happens when you don't know your purpose? I feel like our life is it's stages. It's kind of like we had this stage where we did these things and interacted this way, and then we had this stage. And I think sometimes as we go through our stages of life, it's easy for us to lose our purpose. I read this story this week. It was about an older man, and he'd worked in woodworking for like 40 years, and when he retired, his hands just couldn't do it anymore, and he felt like he had lost his purpose, and he kind of moped around for a couple of years. He kind of had a low spot. He didn't understand what God wanted him to do, And his granddaughter comes to him one day and asks him to make her a dollhouse, and then through that, he did it with his granddaughter because his hands didn't work quite the same as they used to. They formed this bond and this relationship and building this together, and in this relationship he finds his purpose again, and like God had given him these skills that he had his whole life, to be able to connect with her and achieve this goal. And I just really liked that story. I thought that was really good, because so many times we can go through phases where we kind of feel like we forgot our purpose, or it would just be so much easier if God would just send us some mail and explain to us what our purpose is at that point, So going into verse 7 here, finishing up page 107 there, it's this personal relationship, and as we go into this section, there's kind of two themes that run throughout this part. We still have God's omnipresence, his all, he's everywhere, he's all knowing, but then we also have this effect, God's effect on the psalmist, David, or however you want to say that. And so that's very important as we read this next part. So this will be 7 through 16. Where can I go to escape your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I live at the eastern horizon or settle at the western limits, even there your hand will lead me. Your right hand will hold on to me. If I say, Surely the darkness will hide me, and the light around me will be night. Even the darkness is not dark to you. The night shines like the day. The darkness and light are alike to you. For it was you who created my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I will praise you, because I have been remarkably and wondrously made. Your works are wondrous, and I know this very well. My bones were not hidden from you when I was made in secret, when I was formed in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw me when I was formless. All my days were written in your book and planned before a single one of them began. So he has this, what I would call it, a song of praise here in the middle of this psalm. He's talking, and then he just gets so intimate with the relationship, and it just brings him to praise. And so going back, walking through it a little bit, there in verse 7, it kind of starts with these two rhetorical questions. Where can I go to escape your spirit? And where can I flee from your presence? And this is some Hebrew poetry in this chapter. But the implied answer here is nowhere. There's nowhere that you can go. The Old Testament is full of these Hebrew poetry where you've got these rhetorical questions that are asked. God Himself even asks the rhetorical questions sometimes, fully knowing the answer, just trying to draw you to the answer yourself. Is there anything too hard for the Lord? Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Another good one is, can a man hide himself in secret places so that I cannot see him? Do I not fill heaven and earth? There's so many rhetorical questions that are laid out throughout the Old Testament, and I feel like the Psalms kind of highlights those. We always talk about the imagery used in the Psalm, and we do it in our own personal or in our current worship songs as well. Where we create these images of things. But another aspect of human poetry here is, where can I go to escape God's Spirit? He parallels that with, where can I flee from your face, is the Hebrew word that's used there. So you've got the Ruach, the God's Spirit, and you've got the Paneh, God's face, and you can't go anywhere and get away from those. So many times I think that maybe it's part of pride or whatever, but we want God to see what we're doing. Many times we do things and we want some type of recognition, but so many other times we don't. We kind of want the opposite. God, just forget about Thursday night. Take that one off the table if you could. But He's there even on Thursday night when we don't want Him to be. But our lesson states then that God's omnipresence comforts those who trust Him, but is ominous for those rebelling against Him. Man, that is so true. But there is comfort for the faithful, and then there's this warning for the rebellious. There's this. Hebrews 4:13 says, it reinforces this. It says, "No creature is hidden from His sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of Him who we must give an account." And there is this balance between that. The difference isn't, it's not God's presence, but our relationship to in Christ. His presence is our refuge. Outside of Christ, His presence exposes our guilt. So there is this scales that are kind of being weighed back and forth there. God's presence is unavoidable, but whether it is terrifying or comforting, depends on Him, on whether we are running from Him or resting in Him. A.W. Tozer said, "God's presence is the joy of the believer, but it will be the terror of the Christless soul." And then similar to that, there's a Spurgeon quote that I like. It says, "To the child of God, the presence of the Lord is a cause of rejoicing, but to the ungodly, it will be a cause of terror, for they cannot escape His eye, nor flee from His hand." So there is this drasticness to this, as we go into this next part where we're going to start comparing these different opposites. There is this opposite to it already for the believer and for the unbeliever. So verse 8 says, "If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. if I live at the eastern horizon or settle at the western limits, even there your hand will lead me, your right hand will hold on to me. And it is this, if I give this extreme example, and then if I give this oppositely extreme example, that's kind of the parallels that he works through there. No matter what, your eyes are always on me. He says, if I make my bed in Sheol, you were there. And Sheol, in the Old Testament representing, the realm of the dead or the underworld or however you want to label it. But the point is there's no place that God's presence cannot be experienced. You can't escape him or his judgment. Verse 9, which I really like this one. If I live at the eastern horizon or settle at the western limits, and there's a lot of different translations of this that give it a little bit more texture, I guess. The NIRV says, suppose I were to rise with the sun in the east and then cross over to the west where it sinks into the ocean. And that's a pretty good one, trying to point out from one end to the other. The KJV, though, gives it a much different context, really. For me, it says, if I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. That's pretty good. You kind of have this, you're high up in those wings and then you're down in the sea. It's still just as good. It's pointing out the opposites. But God's not only there, he's guiding. And then in verse 10 it says, even there your hand will lead me, your right hand will hold on to me. And this emphasizes God's reach. And when it says your right hand, this implies the care and God's action to protect the psalmist. I feel like it's very personal for me. Not that there's any verse in this that's not personal, but definitely when you think of this right hand on you, we often, especially in the Old Testament, whenever we try to talk about God's characteristics and his attributes, we try to give him these humanly attributes because they're the ones that make sense to us. It's not necessarily saying that his literal right hand is on top of us, as we go on, but there is this care and this protection that he's holding on to us. I like that. And then our lesson states that God always has his eyes on his children, even in the darkest times of life. That's a really good one there. Verse 11 says, if I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light around me will be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night shines like the day. Darkness and light are alike to you. And man, that's so good. Again, just painting this picture as this psalm goes on. Matthew Henry said, to God, the thickest darkness is no cloud. In the darkest night, he can find his own. And in the darkness of affliction of a dungeon cannot separate them from him. I heard this one pastor telling a story of when he was a little boy, he would sneak at night to steal, his mother's baked goods from the kitchen, And when he was very young, he always had this thought that if he just let the lights off, nobody could see him, And I like that, But in the same way, we kind of pretend like that with God sometimes, We kind of pretend like, he's not going to keep up with this one thing. He's not going to see me doing this. He'll definitely overlook this, which is not the case. Alistair Begg says, even in the shadows of our greatest fears, God does not lose sight of us. The darkness that blinds us is transparent to him. So he's just in this other place that is so hard for us to imagine. We had his knowledge and his presence. And lastly, we have his power. Verses 13 through 16. I'll read them one more time here. For it was you who created my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I will praise you because I have been remarkably and wondrously made. Your works are wondrous, and I know this very well. My bones were not hidden from you when I was made in secret, when I was formed in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw me when I was formless. All my days were written in your book and planned before a single one of them began. So we have this next level of Hebrew poetry where you have created my inward parts, and that word there is kiliyah, which means organs. It specifically means more like kidneys. It's used a lot in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, talking about how sacrificial animals and their inner parts and what to do with them and different things. In a more modern sense, I kind of like you created my guts. You created just everything that is in me, and of course they don't mean the literal organs, but more like your heart. I think is a better understanding. The King James Version says, "For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb." And it is used as a metaphor for your inner self, your heart. And he says, "For you fashioned my innermost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb." And so David, he's kind of assigning God the role or the job of the skilled craftsman or a weaver, where he's taking on this job of doing that for each individual person. You knitted or you wove, both of those are pretty common interpretations. But it would have been like an embroidery or a tapestry work, very delicate, very carefully done, but intentional. So God's pictured as this master craftsman at work in the most hidden place, which is the womb, carefully designing and shaping every detail of life. And for all this, verse 15, "I will praise you." David erupts in worship. "I'll praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made," is the ESV typical. If you go to the Christian store and you're going to buy a mug or a sign, that's going to be one of the options for you. Even you can get it on your tie or maybe a bookmarker. But "I'm fearfully and wonderfully made" is a very common thing that we celebrate as Christians. And he says, "My bones were not hidden from you," which is a very neat language there. It's kind of more like my frame, in the Hebrew world, it would have been the last remains of each person. It's the longest lasting part. And in the ancient Near East, they would have considered the bones to be part of your nature to some degree. We don't really have that anymore now, but that is kind of what he's saying there. And so to end my, I think I went over time, but to end my section a little more controversially, verse 16 is the favorite verse of John Calvin. John Calvin, when he reads verse 16, he reads it in a little bit of a different context than we do. John Calvin says, "David means that before he was born, he was enrolled in God's register, and that God had determined what should be the course of his life." And I find that very interesting. I always try to weigh, very reformed, theology and theological views to my own, whereas, I think as Baptists, we have this less of a stress on predestination and all those type of things, and we assign them a different definition, And but I do think, does this somewhat tie into a lot of Reformed views? I do think that's fair to say, Anybody can throw any angry outbursts at any point there, but I do feel like, for us, we do of course give, God's omniscience, this value where he's sovereign and he has this foreknowledge, but at the same time, there is this part, that we have to add into as well, So, all right, you got any thoughts on that? Yeah.
The King James Version, does it use the word, the Hebrew word, shall or shall?
Yes,
Shall.
Sheol, yes.
How many people have tried to find the meaning of the word shall? Well, I got interested. I looked at that. And basically, I found it meant hell. And if you read it that way in verse 8, if I go to the heavens, I go as high as you go. And then he says, also, I make my bed in hell. Yours. It makes you, I guess, more many people are, God is everywhere. Well, he knows where you are, you can be in the next place.
Absolutely.
Keeping in line with that, David, in Philippians, I think it's the second chapter of Philippians where Paul's talking about that, I think back to when Jesus takes Peter and James and John up to the Transfiguration, or one word wasn't coming to the Transfiguration, that he's at this high place and he's equal with God, and then Paul goes on to talk about then he humbled himself and he came to earth as a human, and then he was crucified in the worst death that could be a human, and he just steps down from that high at the Transfiguration all the way down to the lowest level, and that's where Jesus is, and he can meet us in any of those places. There's no place we can't go that he hasn't been, and so I think about that. Also think about that. I'm not a Calvin. I know Wes isn't either. But and I think about a couple of things. I think about and Jacob talked about this a little bit Wednesday night, because he knows that, and I didn't get this, I stole it from someone else, is that when Adam and Eve had sinned, and God comes down for his daily walk in the garden with Adam and Eve, he asked the question, where are you? Adam, where are you? Well, God knows. He knew where they were. He knew exactly what they had done. But that God asked that question, I believe, because as much as God is all-knowing, that his grace is so wonderful, I believe that he was giving them an opportunity to repent. That Adam had the chance to say, Lord, I didn't make it clear to the woman that you gave me, but he did the opposite. This woman you gave me, she basically tricked me into this. The first time in history that the man's got to be something magnanimous, and he said, this woman you gave me, she tricked me. So I believe that, and there's another story, I think it's Moses, where he actually gets God to change his mind on something. That's what he was doing. And I don't know, and if those are the cases that it's not all predetermined. So and I know that's probably the same way that Wes feels too. But I think of those two as a rebuttal.
They did not give us that freedom to make the bad choice.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We could easily say, well, that's all predestined. Everything that happens to us, we're given the free choice. Believe it or not.
Well, that verse that the very last one, verse 16, gets us into this whole discussion that is hard for us in our own human way to fully understand and grasp how much God is aware of. It hurts my brain sometimes when I think about some of these topics, when we get into the knowledge of God, how much God really knows about us. That verse, I think, is particularly there because God does know about what we're going to be doing, what we're thinking. But for us to understand that, to get our hand around that, to understand that we do have free will, that we can make choices, but God is so knowledgeable of us that he knows the directions that we're going to go. It's comforting too. We're kind of running out of time for prayers, but let me just close here. I think this point about being discomfort in a setting of a situation where God knows something, and we know that God knows that about us. And when we talked about forgiveness, we do have to come to God and acknowledge to him what we've done, because he already knows it, but he is a father and he expects us to. Let's cut the video so we can just have a little time of prayer.